Life without hobbies is like piano wire without a body to strangle with it. They just go together, and we all have different ones. I mean, heck, some people juggle geese. If you're on this channel and you're like me, you're probably a collector, and what you collect is probably not lawn gnomes, and it's probably not strange forks and back scratchers. You're most likely collecting things from sci-fi, comic books, movies, video games, all done in plastic articulated form, i.e., a toy collector. Toy collecting is a big hobby, not as big as we think it is because of the internet, but right now it's kind of under attack. I mean, not like literally. I mean, it's not like, Russia invading the Ukraine or something. It's much more like Australia invading New Zealand. Things that we're used to are changing, and believe me, we don't like change. I mean, packaging is changing, right? We're seeing plastic windows eliminated in favor of flat boxes with art, which doesn't allow us to see the toy, and boy, are we seeing product that we consider collector go on clearance over and over and over again. And a big reason for this is selling collector level product at retail is really hard. In price points, oh, don't even get me started on price points. I mean, figures that used to be $19.99, we're now talking like $30 with tax. I mean, this is on shelf right now. And figures that we used to spend and get for $20, literally pretty much the exact same figure, we're seeing now that price increase hitting fourfold, where they're going up almost every year. So the exact same toy comes out one year, and then it comes out the following year, and suddenly we see it for $5 more, or even $10 more. And yes, absolutely, deco drives cost. Believe me, the more deco you put on a figure, that's going to skyrocket the cost. And as collectors, we want details. We want all of the authenticity. So yes, I understand why these cost more, but it's a tough thing to swallow when you could get basically the same character a few years ago for like 2/3 of the price, more or less. Now, kids are always going to want their own thing, and we should let them have their generational heroes, their generational stories and IP, and celebrate that. Getting them to be into the stories and IP that we had as a kid, oh, it's basically like dragging them along for the ride. I mean, they'll come with you and they'll be excited when, you have toys that they also think are cool, but kids want their own thing. But as adult collectors who do like old stuff on shelf, with prices going where they are, with packaging changing, where in the world do we go from here? Is there a future? Well, I think absolutely. And I think things like what Superseven is doing with their Ultimates line is absolutely the future of adult toy collecting. Now, I don't work for Superseven. I'm not here to promote them, but what they are fundamentally doing, I agree with. All right, so let me kind of explain. Here is a retail He-Man, right? It's going to be, I think, like $24.99. It might even be $29.99. I don't know. But if you'll notice, this He-Man has just a sort of moderate amount of deco. In fact, I think even some of the muscle shading has been removed since this photo was taken. Now, if you flash back to something like Classics, which had a lot more deco, I mean, look at the belt and the loincloth alone, and you'll be able to see where this deco really shines, or the hair, the bracelets, those kind of things got these washes. Now, Masters of the Universe Classics started out as $20, but at that time you could buy a 6-inch figure for about $10 or $12, so it was still about 50% more. And we did our best to give you 50% more stuff. Extra heads, extra arms, extra accessories. Heck, sometimes we would even pack a bird in there for you. But the thing is, the reason these were more expensive is because of the lower runs. The lower the run, the more expensive. Retail allows you to do a huge run, but they will only accept a certain amount of SKUs. You can't just take all this stuff and send it to retail. So that's why a retail version of Tila has way less deco and fewer accessories compared to what was offered online. And that's kind of the issue with something like Classics coming back. It's almost too expensive for retail. A Classics figure would be much more like what Superseven does with their Ultimates, which are like $50 figures. Which is why the pre-selling method online is perfect for the adult collector model. And yes, I know that people have, issues with giving, non-refundable loans to toy companies, but expecting toys that we want at the detail, articulation, and character selection and IP selection level to be at mass retail without a Toys R Us, without an FAO Schwartz, without even a KB, well, yeah, we've got toy aisles and Walmart and Target have their collector zone, but even this has to do a certain amount of turns, a certain amount of sales per peg, per week, per month in order for product to stay there. Versus what Superseven does is they pre-sell everything, and you just get a ton of stuff. You get accessories, alternate heads, alternate hands, collector-friendly packaging that you can display the figure actually in the box, if that's what you prefer. And the key is pre-sale, because by doing this, the customer takes the role of what would traditionally be the retailer. Retailers buy a year's worth of product by seeing one or two waves. So that leads to figures on shelf. But they're going to be very selective, especially because of the, shrinking amount of space in the toy aisle. There's more or less 20 feet for boys' action. And having offerings online, whether it's through a third-party company like Superseven or like what HasLab does, selling high-end items themselves, but the key is all of it is done with a pre-sale. And if the pre-sale doesn't hit, like what happened to Bobby the Rancor here, well, it doesn't happen. Versus the Razor Crest did happen because it was able to hit the minimum quantity. And this is the insurance that toy companies need to take the gamble on the huge amount of tooling giant items take. Otherwise, yeah, this guy was at retail, but he was basically at Toys R Us. There's not space for this Galactus at Target. All right, much like Hasbro has HasLab, Mattel also has their version that they've relaunched the last few years called Mattel Creations. And from what I can tell, it'll be basically the same concept. There are some things you can just buy directly, like San Diego Comic-Con items, etc., but the big items, they had a WWE rink a few years back, and it looks like they're going to be focusing and looking at the future. See how I did that Magic 8 Ball? And releasing things much like Superseven is doing, ultimate figures of their IP, as well as much bigger collector versions of things like Mega Bloks. For this to succeed, both Hasbro and Mattel really need to own this type of business. And that's been kind of one of the stumbling blocks in the past of why Hasbro and Mattel were kind of slow to get back onto this. I've mentioned a few times how when I ran the Motu Classics line for Matty Collector and Ghostbusters, Back to the Future, all that jazz, I basically did it at home on the weekends because it was not my actual job. And we were able to go so deep in the character selection because retail wasn't involved. You could sell directly to the fans. If retail was involved, you could only sell what they're willing to carry, and that can be very limiting. So while I love doing Matty Collector, my main job, like if you went to Mattel and you looked me up in their computer and HR, it would say that I was the brand manager and brand director for the DC licensed properties, which included some of the movies, Dark Knight, Green Lantern, but it also included the awesome cool DC Universe Classics line. So this was a retail line, and along with the movie lines that I was also overseeing, this composed what is called a portfolio of brands. And a brand manager has to basically fulfill a certain financial obligation in order to justify what HR would call a head count. What is a head count? A head count is adding an extra employee. So if you're going to add an extra employee, that employee has to manage a certain amount of business and bring in a certain amount of revenue to justify their salary. So the DC license line, the movies, the cartoon shows, the classics line, that was a pretty big portfolio. Again, between the movies and collector and comic, there were several DC lines in there. And I oversaw the whole kit and caboodle for a few years. So this was a portfolio of brands that fell under my guidance as brand manager. On the other hand, something like Matty Collector is basically more like a few pennies, especially for a $7 billion company. So at the time, Mattel couldn't justify hiring a full-time brand manager. Now, as they move forward, and they're showing things like the Eternia playset for Origins, which I guess also works for Masterverse, which would be very exciting, this needs to be a full-time job to succeed, because without the resources, it becomes very tough to have the bandwidth and the know-how to connect with the fans to make the product sell. Alright, well, I hope this video provided at least some insight and some thoughts as to where the future of collecting can go, and honestly, in my mind, it's online with pre-sales, regardless of who's doing it. Superseven, Mattel, NECA, some guy in his garage down the street. Hey, if you want those toys, now the power's in our hands, and it's time for us to step up. Make those pre-sales happen. And if not, I guess stop complaining.